get the program started, and we're just really pleased to have everybody here. So, Aaron, it's yours.
All right, thank you very much, Skip, and welcome everyone once again to Great Decisions. It's nice to have you here from literally across the country, and it's really nice to be back for week 2. So, ground truthing is a term we use in the social sciences when we get feet on the ground to verify and test our models and our theories. And today's guest speaker, Dr. Steve Tall, has built a long and fascinating career ground truthing global. Sorry, we have someone off mute there. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. As I said, he has built a long and fascinating career ground truthing the global political and humanitarian affairs in our world in some of the world's most challenging locations. Dr. Tall received his doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan in 1995. And it is important to note, he is also a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan University. Here in our hometown, where he also worked very closely with Dr. Corinne Lyman, who I know is out here in the audience today and is one of the instrumental architects of our Great Decision series over the years. So both prior to and following his PhD at the University of Michigan, Steve made a profound impact on our world through his career with the United Nations in particular. His CV, it reads like a James Bond novel. Chief of Staff for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Resident Director, Humanitarian Director roles in a long list of countries across the globe, including Chad, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, former Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Switzerland, Afghanistan, and, pertinent for today, the Russian Federation. So through this academic focus on ethnicity and nationalism, and a very storied career on the ground with a concentration in the former Soviet and communist regions of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, Dr. Tall brings over 30 years of knowledge and experience to our conversation today. In today's presentation, Steve will be talking about the historical and contemporary political conditions in the Russian Federation and how Russia relates to the world around it. And of course, today's talk goes without saying, comes at a very tragic and timely moment as we continue to watch the Russian military invasion of Ukraine unfold on our TV and on our computer screens. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Tall, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Skip and Aaron, and it's great to be back with you all. And unfortunately, indeed, the topic today is something that probably many of you join me in being a bit depressed about. You know, Putin's Russia, when I was first offered the chance to do this talk with you today, this wasn't really on the horizon. It wasn't that clear. But obviously, we have a very poignant historical moment now to look at this question. I think the first question I'd like to start off with, is it Putin's Russia or just Russia that we are dealing with and seeing right now? Why I ask that is will come up a lot as I go through my talking points, is that, you know, modern Russia, the elites as well as the populace, really has an age-old foreign policy outlook of a country surrounded. And so they have a perspective of needing to keep a hardened frontier to protect them from threats abroad. Now, why? Let me just see if I can capture technology here and get you a slide to look at. Let's see, yes. I'll try to get, sorry about this technological moment. But anyway, some of you will probably recognize, one second, some of you will recognize that as the board from the game of Risk, which I think many people are familiar with. And it came to mind as I was thinking about the situation we're in with Ukraine right now. And I'm sorry, just All right. I don't suppose that is on the screen. One second, technological challenges. Here we go.
Well, Steve, while you're pulling that up, if we could just ask everyone to please check to make sure you are muted. We have some background noise from one of our guests.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead with this. I guess you can see the map. I was trying to get it in full screen, but I believe that you can all see it now. And this is the risk game board. And the question is, for those of you who have played it, have you ever tried the strategy of holding Asia, the green part here, or Europe, the blue, or all of it, Eurasia? It's extremely difficult in the game, and that's because of the geopolitical exposure to invasion. Russia is, just to go through a few geopolitical facts about Russia's exposure, it is by far the largest country in the world, about twice the size of Canada and the US, or Canada or the US individually. It has a land border of 14,000 miles spanning, bordering 14 different countries. And if you compare that with the US, we're about half that many miles of border with only 2 countries, Canada and Mexico. The coastline of Russia is 23,000 miles versus about 12,000 miles for the US. Now, and it's also an incredibly diverse population, as you would expect from such a large landmass, ethnically, and all the ways that you might cut that down, religious, historical, etc. So this is part of why I chose this map, just to reinforce the idea that it's not, it is understandable that historically this hardened frontier fixation has gained a place in the Russian psyche, the national psyche. It's a practical historical orientation. So that's something we'll come back to. And you've probably gotten a good sense, a good reminder of this, because everything that we're hearing about what is it that Russia wants to achieve, it's all about hardening the frontier, putting a buffer zone between itself and NATO and the European Union. So next question again is whether we are seeing today a Russia of Putin's making, or how differently things might be if there was other leadership in Russia. To me, it feels like we're in the Cold War again, right? The conflict in Ukraine is a kind of hot war that we were all so worried about during the Cold War. And it's quite a dangerous moment because of that. Just to go back to how Putin came into power, remember the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. It went surprisingly smoothly. There were, of course, difficulties and some conflict, but just the 1990 German reunification was an amazing historical moment. And it meant, among other things, that Eastern Germany now became united with Germany, part of NATO, something unthinkable throughout the Cold War. The 90s, there were attempts on all sides to build a constructive relationship. And I think there was a lot of optimism and seemed a bit of a reprieve from the Cold War tensions. But by 1999, and this is when Putin rose to prominence, the adversarial relationship between Russia and the West was very clear again. Russia was not threatening the US or Europe or anywhere beyond its near abroad, but there was the tension there. And I think that has just gotten worse and worse since Putin came to power. He became head of the National Security Council and then prime minister in 99, and then eventually president in 99. And since that time, the US-Russian relations have gone from bad to worse. So what was going on in 1999? Well, NATO enlargement was underway. The Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary were admitted into NATO in 1999. There was the war in Kosovo and in Serbia, which was claiming Kosovo still at the time. And NATO was active participant against Serbian forces in that war. Plus, the EU and the US were principally supporting Kosovo's bid for independence, which set a real precedent that Russian leaders, including Putin, love to reflect back on and say, well, the example was set in Kosovo and some of the other countries that were seeking independence at that time on ethno-national grounds. So this is used to justify, for example, in 2014, the occupation of Crimea and the eastern part, the Donbass of Ukraine, among other places. Putin rose to power, and I think, unlike his predecessor, Yeltsin and Gorbachev, obviously, he was not really given a warm welcome by the West. He also immediately, as probably his most important first act as president in 1999, launched what they call the second war in Chechnya, and through extreme use of force and pressure, managed to get control on Chechnya fairly quickly. Now, Putin himself has famously called the breakup of the USSR the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, and said and shown that he effectively is determined to reestablish or reassert Russia's place as a world power and resecure the Soviet era sphere of influence, again, back to the concept of protecting the frontier. NATO's expansion has always been seen by Russia as a direct threat, and Putin has been trying to stop it. I'm going to try once more to share my screen. And here we have NATO's membership here. The purple colors are NATO members before 1997, and the orange ones are NATO members since 1997, which, as you see, basically includes Eastern Europe, most of the Eastern Europe and former Soviet Republic allied with Russia or part of the USSR up until that point. So this is the reality of NATO expansion eastward, which gives some credibility to Putin and others in Russia's concern about an aggressive fighting force built on a charter, Cold War charter, to fight and contain the Soviet power coming right up to its border. And Ukraine has also for about 15 years or so been talking about wanting NATO membership too. Now, Putin, when he came to power, he promised security for the people, economic stability, and a return of national pride. And he has basically delivered on that. He's remained quite popular in Russia. Also, to his character, he always plays hardball. I was in Russia during or right after the major second Chechen war and dealing with the aftermath of that. And he spared nobody in that war. It was a brutal attack on Grozny in particular, and other places where Russia has intervened since. It's it's brinksmanship in negotiations, and it's hardball and the use of repression and military intervention as necessary. Today's Russian Federation, however, even with its alliances, is a small, much less powerful shadow of the USSR. This, I think, is frustrating still to many Russians. And it's a role that most of the Russian leadership, I would say, refuses to accept. So now let's look at Ukraine, where the Russian military entered a week ago now only, with a mission to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Strange mission, but somehow justifying what they're doing. Behind all the rhetoric, I believe that what it's about is, again, to win back some kind of buffer zone and harden the frontier. Now, here's another slide I want to show, which again comes from the source of Great World Maps. Risk. Don't know if you all noticed this before, but Russia is a little bit west of where we usually think of Russia now. The part I've circled in red here essentially are the now independent Baltic states, Moldova, and the Ukraine. So why is this the historical Russia? This is the thing that you've probably heard Putin has been for at least 20 years, espousing an idea that Ukraine and Ukrainians are really Russia and Russians. And this risk map of Russia here, I think, corresponds largely to something called Old Rus, which was a 9th to 13th century union of Slavic entities, Slavic kingdoms. And it's kind of seen as the heartland of modern Russia and the Eastern Slavic states. So, not that it justifies anything that's happening today in Ukraine, but this is sort of the historical linkage with Ukraine that Putin is talking about protecting. There's also, as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union and migration over years and years and decades, there's estimated to be at least 12 million, maybe as many as 17 million ethnic Russians in Ukraine. That would include Crimea and the Donbas regions that have been effectively occupied by Russia since. And there's probably 2 million Ukrainians in the Russian Federation. I remember I was in Moscow in 2004 for the presidential elections and was rather surprised to see big billboards, political campaign billboards for the presidential candidates all around Moscow. And this just showed, and then I visited Ukraine shortly after that and also saw that that the strong orientation toward Russia still then. So there is a long historical and emotional attachment here that I think Putin and the Russian leadership were hoping to tap into and engage in as allies. Now, I think in the mission, the current mission, one question we're probably all wondering about, what do the Russian people think about this invasion of Ukraine? It's too early to tell, but I believe that the Russian people are by and large ready to support this kind of action abroad, as long as it's justified by, one, the hardening of the frontier for protection of Russia, and two, some kind of ethnopolitical rationale, protecting ethnic Russians or reuniting with historical brothers and sisters abroad. So that is why I believe that this NATO expansion slide is really important to keep in mind as all this is unfolding. This is why the Russians believe that they are under attack by the US/NATO, and they view Ukraine as just the latest weak point that the West is trying to exploit in reaching Russia's border. You may recall 2008, Russian forces also entered Georgia, South Ossetia, part of Georgia. And Russia had previously, ever since Georgia left the Soviet Union, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, its two breakaway republics, got strong Russian support. They were also fighting back against Georgia, seeking NATO membership, which has not come yet. So here, NATO, even talking with Ukraine, some American and European leaders and Ukrainian leaders talking about Ukraine entering NATO is a big red flag for Russia, and I think all of the Russian people. Let me give a few bits of data from public opinion. There's something called the Levada Center in Russia, which does excellent public opinion polls, quite reliable. And they did a survey almost a year ago, April last year, that found that 48% of Russians blame the US or NATO for the situation in eastern Kazakhstan, that led to the Russian support of the rebels there since 2014. That compares with only 4% blaming Russia. So that's 48% blame US or NATO, 4% blame Russia, only 20% blame the Kiev leadership. And while only 37% of Russians believed a year ago that Russia would go to war, full-out war in Ukraine, a majority said that Russia should intervene militarily in Ukraine should a full-out war break out. And 70% at that time also welcomed incorporation of the Donetsk and Luhansk territories into Russia proper, which is something which Putin is open to and has just officially recognized their independence. Putin continues by Levada poll that took place just a couple of weeks ago. He continues to have 71% approval ratings among the Russian population. So, why? I think the Russian people, again, are ready to sacrifice. It's a historical kind of orientation. They're ready to sacrifice on the domestic front because they perceive that they're in an emergency situation. I think that the very strong sanctions, which I'll turn to in a moment, announced last week, are seen as inevitable by the Russian people. In fact, ever since the 2014 occupation of Crimea, when there were quite strong sanctions against Russia, they've seen it as inevitable and just accepted all of the consequences. So where is all this heading? I'll just go quickly through what could be some of the future battlegrounds for Russia's sphere of influence or its buffer zone. The most obvious being the former Soviet republics, states, and the Slavic world in particular. But of course, with NATO's expansion already to include most of them, this could be quite tricky. A lot of the commentators that are academic specialists on Russia and this part of the world and Europe and European security are concluding right now and speaking out quite a lot that what is going to be needed out of this Ukrainian crisis is a whole negotiated new European or Euro-Atlantic security order. And And how that will look, how it will be achieved, and whether or not Putin's Russia would actually negotiate on something like that or accept anything like the current security order are big questions. Central Asia, where I've spent a lot of time as well, is an area of some uncertainty. Before Ukraine crisis, I was planning on talking a lot about events in January, mainly in Kazakhstan, my old home. There on January 6th, there was social disorder and also possibly some warnings that there might be some kind of coup attempt against the sitting president. And the president of Kazakhstan asked President Putin of Russia to send in peacekeepers to help them get control. Security forces under something called the CSTO, which is a group of 6 countries around Russia providing a sort of mutual security pact, came in, and it was a big win for Putin and for Russia and the CSTO, because these troops, small number of them, only like 2,000, came quickly. They seemed to be, the CSTO in Russia seemed to be a powerful, reliable force for stability in Central Asia. So this keeps open that option throughout Central Asia. Kazakhstan is also part of something called the Eurasian Economic Union, which is really the same members. So that's Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. And in 2014, when the US and Europe put biting sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Crimea, there were lots of efforts at sanctions busting that were going through Kazakhstan and Belarus. And I think this keeps it in a very important, Central Asia, very important neighbor area for Putin and Russia. The Caucasus remain locked in frozen conflicts, Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then Georgia, as I mentioned before. And another possible battleground I just want to flag, it's been something I've been a bit fixated with since my time in Russia, because that's when Russia began to very actively build up its infrastructure, began exploring for resources and militarizing its part of the Arctic. I believe the Arctic could be a hotspot in relations for NATO and Russia in the future, especially built around a big race for natural resources. So kind of going into the final part, because I see time is fleeting, I want to leave plenty of time for discussion here. What are some of the impacts of what's happening now in Ukraine for the post-Cold War order? First of all, it seems pretty clear that European Union member states and the European Union are reconsidering some of their policies on energy and security in particular, probably building much less reliance on Russia for energy. You probably heard that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines project has been suspended, or actually I think is now asking for bankruptcy. Another thing is that Europe probably will be trying to build different, more self-reliant defense systems. It's very hard, I think, to hope for a constructive relationship between NATO and Russia in the short term, certainly. The invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and now certainly has united the Ukrainians in their commitment to independence. It's also united and reoriented NATO very much against Russia, I think. And so we're likely to see some form of containment returning to be the kind of security principle that NATO is openly pursuing. And that will, of course, not go well with Russia. The Ukrainians are committed to fight this fight, I think. And Russia made a big miscalculation in going into Ukraine, thinking it would be a cakewalk. However, most military experts, I think, agree that it's hard to see how the Ukrainians could win. So they are open for negotiation, but not to give away their country. What could Russia possibly win? If it occupies Ukraine, it will be a lengthy and very difficult occupation with strong resistance. And there, I think we would have also all kinds of Cold War type proxy support and risks of conflict with the West. Now, the sanctions are far more than what I think Putin and the leadership in Russia expected. And they're basically an act of economic war, and they're huge. And the coordination is amazing. Europe is going after the oligarchs. They're going after the economic global connectedness of Russia. Even Switzerland and Monaco have been engaging on the sanctions. So we can expect to see a real catastrophe in Russia itself, first economic, but it could possibly lead to civil strife and security challenges. Probably for quite a long time, Russia will be facing economic isolation, much like the Soviet Union was isolated for much of the Cold War. Now, sanctions are always very tricky to impose, enforce, and get the results you want from them. So what people talk about smart sanctions. Is there a way to target them? And that's what's been tried before with Russia. But these are much more broad and sharp sanctions. Can they be made smart and eventually help to move toward a compromise? I think not very easily. This is something to really watch how that develops. Now, domestically in Russia, we can expect and are already seeing greater repression. Independent media is already closing down and being closed down, and with threats of jail time for people who speak against Russian leadership and this military action. And Putin, I would say, seems still very much in control. Some speculate maybe there could be an elite movement, a coup of sorts, particularly by some of the security figures, to remove Putin. I don't know about that. We'll see. Again, I think that most of the leadership is with him. I don't think this is entirely a Russia or an action of Putin's making. So they're all kind of implicated, and it would be hard for a real elite movement against him to take foot, I believe. So rather, we're likely to see this continuing sense of a national emergency within Russia, which, as in the past, as in the Soviet period, really will empower Putin and his allies and supporters, who are mainly the security force leaders and commanders. They're all stuck. I like this kind of metaphor. There's a Russian phrase, and I can't remember it in Russian, but I came upon it again, that how do you get out of a submarine? All the oligarchs, the Russian political leadership, they're all stuck in the same submarine right now, deep, deep underwater. So there's not an easy way to get out of this situation for them. So just to end, I'd say thank you all for coming, and I'm really looking forward to your observations on what's happening. we're probably all wondering not only what will happen with Ukraine in the near term, but what will Putin or Putin's Russia do next after all of this. I'll go on mute now. Aaron, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Steve. That was very informative, very interesting to hear. So thanks for all of you there. We're going to open up to questions. We thought with such a large group, we might request that unless you specifically really want to come on microphone, we prefer you put the questions in the chat. And I see a lot of you are. And we'll kind of feed those out. I will start us off with one question for you. As you were discussing the long history of kind of a geopolitical siege mentality that is woven into Russian political culture because of the physical geography and the history of invasion from various fronts. More recently, of course, you have containment in NATO and US, and even a little bit earlier with English efforts too, to kind of hem Russia in. And then kind of this kind of back and forth dance we've seen, like you mentioned, the Republic of Georgia in the early 2000s, Ukraine on various moments, talk about reintegration with Belarus, the ever-present concern of the Baltics. Why now is my question. Like, what do you think prompted this invasion of Ukraine now, not a year from now or 5 years from now? Oh, and I think you might be
That's a very good question. Calling for me to try to get inside of Putin's head, but yeah, I think that really it was this has been building over the past certainly since 2014. This could have happened anytime in there, and I think probably why now is that Putin just thought they could get away with it now. For whatever reasons, the world, focused on other things, believing that within Ukraine, the forces were aligned to go along with this, and not getting any foothold in his persistent calls for NATO to retract, to pull back from its eastern expansion. So the very thought of Ukraine becoming a NATO state, Georgia as well, has been haunting him. And then, of course, the other NATO states right on the border, I think is something that he feels for his legacy is unacceptable. So that probably it's an effort to, he's been giving much more attention to, again, plain brinksmanship is his style. So giving much more effort to find ways to force NATO and the EU, for that matter, to pull back a bit more. They've given all the correct, NATO has consistently given assurances up until now that the eastward expansion of NATO was not intended to threaten Russia and they were not going to attack Russia. But of course, I don't believe that the Russian leadership believed that. So they were just intent on pushing NATO back and thought this was the moment they might have a chance to do it, had nothing to lose.
Okay, thank you. So I see we have a long list of questions. Let me field the first one. It kind of ties in with what you just discussed a little, so it'll be good. You started out your talk, you mentioned about, was this Russia, is that Putin's Russia, or would any leader in Russia be dealing with many of the same situations? And that was a question that was in the chat. Kind of, is this just Vladimir Putin having to save face by not be willing to back down? What is an exit ramp that the West might be able to offer to quell some of the tensions that we're seeing?
They're going to have to be, this is what I said, I think the negotiations will need to be about European and Russian security for the new era, for the future. And as I suggested, I think that's a very hard conversation to start, and it's hard for me to foresee how to get it constructive, how to get Russia to engage in this, because they've been simply dogmatic about NATO pullback, and that's not going to happen. So they're going to have to, first of all, they're going to have to start talking about the economic situation and how to relieve Russia of the sanctions. And there's going to have to be an awful lot of back and forth carrot and stick kind of talk before they come to any common ground at all. Now, in the seemingly most likely event that Russia is occupying all or part of Ukraine, most of Ukraine, in the near future, I don't think there's going to be much of an appetite on either side to enter into these talks. That's why I think this is an extremely dangerous development that leaves us in a bad situation for years to come. Ultimately, Russian leadership is going to want assurances about security all the way around its territory. And so this brings in also not only the important Central and Southern Asian countries, but China. And when China gets into a discussion about this global security order, we might actually be into a much bigger and more challenging issue of kind of a tripartite division of spheres of influence around the world between Russia, the US, and China. So not very optimistic about the near term on this, Aaron.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let me go to another question that'll tie in with us then. Obviously, at least here in our media, there's been a lot of focus on Vladimir Putin lately, talking about, in a very different way, the nuclear arsenal. And from your historical knowledge of this region, do you see that is there something fundamentally different about how Russia is talking about the use of nuclear weapons, and is that a concern that you have?
It's a big concern because, as I mentioned, that we are in the kind of hot war that during the Cold War had everyone terrified. This is the kind of conflict scenario that, particularly with the development of nuclear weapons, more field-oriented and tactical, that either side might be tempted to threaten or use nuclear weapons. Also, if Russia goes beyond Ukraine and attacks a NATO member country, which is what is left on the other side, other than Moldova, then that's also obviously part of NATO's deterrent. And so this is a very worrying aspect. But frankly, I think that the mention of the use of nuclear weapons in the Russian-Belarus military exercises prior to the invasion, and then the kind of implied threat of possible nuclear force being used in Ukraine by Russia, I think is kind of a bluff. I don't think that there's any serious, I don't think there's a need for them to go nuclear to take at least control of some of Ukraine. But it's very worrying, yes.
It kind of gets to the question of what is the end game for Russia too. If their plan is to occupy or even reintegrate Ukraine into Russia's territory, they're probably not going to want to do that, right? I would say. Hopefully. So what about, like, you're obviously some of your expertise there within the domestic sphere in Russia as well. We have a couple questions in the chat asking about the modern world where we have so much social networks and the ability for civil society to really take on a life beyond the official state media and the state control of the major institutions. What do you see as the potential there for Russia, someone asks, for social activism to really foment an opposition to Putin and to the rule by oligarchy that we see?
First of all, I mean, back to my kind of perhaps pessimistic read on public opinion in Russia. I think that most of the Russians, for the time being, will continue to support this engagement. Now, longer term, if in a scenario of an occupation of Ukraine, which is very deadly for Russian forces, and also opens up all kinds of other issues in addition to the economic bite of the sanctions. You could see some more of the population becoming a bit skeptical. But that's a long way from a social movement that might change the government. And I don't see that as a prospect, really. Not even the near future, in the medium term either. The social media, I mean, people in Russia have been quite savvy and using social media for years. And they're limited by censorship and repression, which now obviously, the Western social media outlets are blocked in Russia. And the information flow is more controlled, and the Russians are really good at that. Remember, this is kind of, information is one of the main tools of war. They're quite good at that, and I think we'll continue to keep the control on the information and keep the public rather sympathetic to what's happening. Again, how long that can be sustained is anybody's guess, but over 20 years of some pretty brave opposition to Putin's leadership, there hasn't been a major groundswell of support for the opposition, and the opposition leaders have ended up in jail or dead.
Yeah, not too many Václav Havels out there, right? So, following on here, a question from Skip about the influence of the Russian and/or Ukrainian Orthodox Church. What do you see as their role in domestic affairs in Russia? What is their role in the Ukraine-Russia conflict that's going on? Is there any opportunity there to bridge some of the divides around the question of religion?
We can be hopeful, but I think in my experience, we shouldn't be too hopeful that will be a point for breakthrough. I mean, I go back to my time in Yugoslavia and former Yugoslavia, and even Russia's support for the ethnic Serbs and other traditionally Orthodox communities there. Putin as a diehard, I don't think anybody would consider him to be a God-fearing man, but he has rather adeptly used the links with the Orthodox Church leadership in Russia. And I think they will be trying to, use the links with the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, I believe, to rather support his thesis that they are all one people and need to be united rather than torn apart. And unfortunately, I think the history of the Orthodox Church is rather more open to that kind of approach than trying to unite the people in a peaceful effort to break up that union effectively, I'm afraid.
Okay. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here for time. So there have been a couple questions here. One asking simply, is Putin unstable? There's been a lot of talk in the news from leaks from the intelligence community and elsewhere suggesting that they have concerns that something has fundamentally gone wrong in his thinking process. But also along with that, we haven't really talked much about the international system, the United Nations, which you're very familiar with, the International Criminal Court. There has been talk about whether or not Putin directly or others could be charged with war crimes or crimes against humanity. What are your thoughts on some of those and the implications there?
Okay. On the first question, is Putin crazy? I mean, seems pretty crazy what he's doing in Ukraine for some of the reasons I've mentioned, and I'm sure all of you have thought about. But I would say Putin is being Putin. And I don't see, and I haven't really read anyone's analysis that's persuaded me that he's actually lost his mind or that he's acting irrationally. He's acting as Putin sees the world and sees that part of the world and sees his historical role, which he has himself said is to basically undo the crime of the breakup of the Soviet Union and effectively build the next Russian empire. So I don't think that's what's going on. And that's one reason I think he will continue to be able to remain in power among the elites in Russia. On the question of the international organizations and the UN in particular and the ICC, the problem there, of course, is that Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and can just basically say, no, we're not going to talk about that. In fact, I had lost track, but ironically, Russia was chairing the Security Council for up until March 1st. So the beginning of this invasion of Ukraine, Russia was chairing the Security Council, setting the agenda and such. So I think the UN on the political side will try to, of course, support any efforts at dialogue and negotiation, but will not be able to do much beyond that on the political side to pressure Russia to back off. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the UN Human Rights Council and High Commissioner for Human Rights, among others, will be tracking human rights violations and crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and will attempt to hold people accountable, but those will not have any deterrent impact, in my view, as the conflict is going on. That's kind of there's still a historical afterthought in terms of having an impact on ongoing conflicts today.
Okay, thanks. So just a couple more questions there. I know I've heard people say that there's a lot of parallels to the German annexation of the Sudetenland, for example, in terms of the reasoning behind it and the moves being made. There's been a lot of talk about the kind of far right movement in Ukraine, and this obviously Putin's rhetoric being that we're going down there to stop the neo-Nazis. I was wondering if you might share with us a little about that, because that's, I know, kind of a hot button issue on the news.
Well, I'm afraid I'm not by any means an expert on Ukraine, and I'm afraid that's something way beyond my knowledge of kind of current situation with the population in Ukraine. It is obviously powerful rhetoric and in line with the kinds of justifications that Russia and its allies like to use for military intervention, especially against another territory. And so I expect we'll keep hearing that rhetoric. And certainly since, let's just say certainly since the 2014 Crimea and Donbass occupations, I believe that it would make sense for kind of extreme Ukrainian nationalist movements to have become more influential, get more support. This is kind of the nature of this sort of ethno-political conflict. It's self-feeding and perpetuating. But I don't think in any way this notion of denazifying Ukraine, which was part of the mission that Putin set out for the troops, is legitimate. And and quite the contrary. I think if the invasion will strengthen the strong Ukrainian nationalist hand and probably radicalize lots of Ukrainians who never had any kind of sympathy with this. So not that it's a neo-Nazi kind of movement, but just a strong anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism. And this is why the kind of scenario of an extended occupation of Ukraine is going to be so painful for Russia.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now we have time if you have time. Just one last quick question we had up above from Raina. I was asking essentially, what are your thoughts on physical geography and climate in particular as a driver of conflict? And she made reference specifically to a canal that was reopened whenever Russia when they annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and then it was closed, or the canal was closed down, and now it's been reopened, I guess, to bring water back to many of the ethnic Russian population in Crimea. So she's asking, what are some of your thoughts on how climate change and climate factors might influence conflict in the region?
Yeah, we could go into a lot of detail there. And again, I'm not the right person to give a whole lot of that detail, but obviously we live in a world, and probably the world has always been like this, but we live in a world where it's very amplified with the climate change and the environmental hardship we're inflicting as humans on the world, where the countries and people face environmental disaster, face changes, and need to have reliable resources. And then their governments are responsible for making sure they have that. So I believe it's going to be an important consideration in looking around the Russian Republic, Russian Federation, and in talking about the future order, security, and economic order that might replace the Cold War kind of position we're in now. Energy, water, natural resources of metals in particular that are essential for modern industrial economies are things that countries will fight over if they can't have peaceful trade and production. And right now we're in a situation where we're kind of moving away from that kind of international trade and flow. So it certainly will be, I think, one of the main points for negotiations on the way ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I know we are at the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of your time. Is there any last comment you would like to add as we conclude?
I think not. I mean, I'm fine on time, and again, I appreciate all the interest, and I know that many of you are very actively are political activists in your own right, and probably actively trying to appeal to our own government and to communicate with others around the world that you know who are equally bound up in the current crisis. I think just, keep the courage, keep going. It's one of the most delicate historical moments, I think, of the post-Cold War era and perhaps of my life. So we have to, as a world, get through this without too much further damage than what's already, I think, bound to happen.
Yeah, Skip Cornett here, program coordinator, director of the committee. Let me say three things real quick. Steve, thank you so much. It was just excellent. There was so much good information that it was very accessible, and it kind of explained the bigger picture. The map that you showed us of NATO expansion, wow, I had no idea that. What a picture that is. That really tells us something. So thank you for all of your good stuff there, good information. Aaron, thank you very much for your moderating of the conversation and handling the questions and getting them in. And to everyone who's here, thank you all for your participation, your attendance, and the questions that you posed. I mean, this really became a great conversation. I think we learned a lot. So in that regard, let me say that there is a recording, and I will have the recording posted a little bit later, so it will be available because some people ask about that. Final note is about next week. We are shifting to another part of the world, to Myanmar, previously known as Burma, and we have a PhD student from the Department of Political Science at Wayne State University who is finishing up her PhD on that topic. And so happens that she is from India, but lives in Michigan. So I'm looking forward to that. And as I said to her, I'll say to you all, let's shift our focus because there's some serious human rights issues going on in that part of the world right now. So again, thank you all very much. Aaron, any final last word?
Just to echo what you said there, Skip, to thank you all for coming today, and a special thanks to you, Steve, as it was very informative, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Everybody have a nice day. Thank you very much. And next week, see you next week. Many of you.
Thank you all.
All right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.